You know who I saw a couple of months ago? Your brother. Did he tell you? No, he didn't. He wrote me a letter and invited me to dinner in New York. A nice letter, out of the blue. I drove down to meet him. He was composing a tribute to your old man. In the letter, he asked for my help. I was curious about what he had in mind. I was curious about him writing to me to announce that he wanted to write something. To you, he's just a brother. To me, he's still the Swede. You carried those guys around with you forever. I had to drive down. But at dinner, he never mentioned the tribute. We just uttered the pleasantries at some place called Vincent's. That was it. As always, he looked terrific. He's dead. Your brother's dead? Died Wednesday. Funeral 2 days ago. Friday. That's why I was in Jersey. Watched my big brother die. Of what? How? Cancer. But he had prostate surgery. He told me they got it out. Impatiently, Jerry said, what else is he going to tell you? He was thin, that's all. That wasn't all. So, the Swede, too. What, astoundingly to Mendy Gerlich, was decimating the daredevils right up the middle? What, astoundingly to me, had a year earlier made of me purely a writer? What, in the wake of all the other isolating losses, in the wake of everything gone and everyone gone, had stripped me down into someone whose aging powers had now but a single and unswerving aim, a man who would be seeking his solace, like it or not, nowhere but in sentences, had managed the most astounding thing of all by carrying off the indestructible hero of the wartime Wequahic section, our neighborhood talisman, the legendary Swede. Did he know, I asked, when I saw him that he was in trouble? He had his hopes, but sure he knew, metastasized all through him. I'm sorry to hear that. His 50th was coming up next month. You know what he said at the hospital? On Tuesday, to me and his kids, the day before he died. Most of the time he was incoherent, but twice he said, so we could understand him, going to get to my 50th. He had heard everyone from his class was asking, will the Swede be there? And he didn't want to let them down. He was very stoical. He was a very nice, simple, stoical guy. Not a humorous guy, not a passionate guy, just a sweetheart whose fate it was to get himself fucked over by some real crazies. In one way, he could be conceived as completely banal and conventional, an absence of negative values and nothing more, bred to be dumb, built for convention, and so on. That ordinary, decent life they all want to live, and that's it. The social norms, and that's it. Benign, and that's it. But what he was trying to do was to survive, keeping his group intact. He was trying to get through with his platoon intact. It was a war for him, finally. There was a noble side to this guy. Some excruciating renunciations went on in that life. He got caught in a war he didn't start, and he fought to keep it all together, and he went down. But now, conventional, maybe not. People could think that. I don't want to get into judging. My brother was the best you're going to get in this country, by a long shot. I was wondering while he spoke if this had been Jerry's estimate of the Swede while he was alive. If there wasn't perhaps a touch of mourner's rethinking here, remorse for a harsher Jerry-like view he might once have held of the handsome older brother, sound, well-adjusted, quiet, normal, somebody everybody looked up to, the neighborhood hero to whom the smaller Lvov had been endlessly compared, while himself evolving into something slightly ersatz. This kindly, unjudging judgment of the Swede could well have been a new development in Jerry. Compassion, just a few hours old, that can happen when people die. The argument with them drops away, and people so flawed while they were drawing breath that at times they were all but unbearable, now assert themselves in the most appealing way. And what was least to your liking the day before yesterday becomes in the limousine behind the hearse a cause not only for sympathetic amusement, but for admiration. In which estimate lies the greater reality? The uncharitable one permitted us before the funeral, forged without any claptrap in the skirmish of daily life? Or the one that suffuses us with sadness at the family gathering afterward? Even an outsider can't judge. The sight of a coffin going into the ground can effect a great change of heart. All at once you find you're not so disappointed in this person who is dead. But what the sight of a coffin does for the mind in its search for the truth, this I don't profess to know. My father, Jerry said, was one impossible bastard. Overbearing, omnipresent. I don't know how people work for him. When they moved to Central Avenue, the first thing he had the movers move was his desk. And the first place he put it was not in the glass-enclosed office, but dead center in the middle of the factory floor so he could keep his eye on everybody. You can't imagine the noise out there, the sewing machines whining, the clicking machines pounding, hundreds of machines going all at once. And right in the middle, his desk and his telephone and the great man himself, the owner of the glove factory. But he would always sweep his own floors, especially around the cutters where they cut the leather, because he wanted to see from the size of the scraps who was losing money for him. I told him early on to fuck off, but Seymour wasn't built like me. He had a big, generous nature, and with that they really raked him over the coals, all the impossible ones. Unsatisfiable father, unsatisfiable wives, and the little murderer herself, the monster daughter, the monster Mary, the solid thing he once was. At Newark Maid, he was an absolute, unequivocal success. Charmed a lot of people into giving their all for Newark Maid. Very adroit businessman, knew how to cut a glove, knew how to cut a deal. Had an inn on 7th Avenue with the fashion people. The designers there would tell the guy anything. That's how he stayed abreast of the pack. In New York, he was always stopping into the department store, shopping the competition, looking for something unique about the other guy's product. Always in the stores, taking a look at the leather, stretching the glove, doing everything just the way my old man taught him. Did most of the selling himself. Handled all the big house accounts. The lady buyers went nuts for Seymour, you can imagine. He'd come over to New York, take these tough Jewish broads out to dinner, buyers who can make or break you, wine and dine them. They'd fall head over heels for the guy. Instead of him buttering them up, by the end of the evening, they'd be buttering him up. Come Christmas time, they'd be sending my brother the theater tickets in the case of scotch rather than the other way around. He knew how to get the confidence of these people just by being himself. He'd find the buyer's favorite charity, get a ticket to the annual dinner at the Waldorf Astoria, show up like a movie star in his tuxedo, on the spot make a fat donation to cancer, muscular dystrophy, whatever it was. United Jewish Appeal. Next thing, Newark Maid had the account. Knew all the stuff. What colors are going to be next season's colors, whether the length is going to be up or down. Attractive. Responsible, hardworking guy. Couple of unpleasant strikes in the 60s, a lot of tension, but his employees are out on the picket line and they see him pull up in the car and the women who saw the gloves start falling all over themselves, apologizing for not being at the machines. They were more loyal to my brother than they were to the union. Everybody loved him. A perfectly decent person who could have escaped stupid guilt forever. No reason for him to know anything about anything except gloves. Instead, he's plagued with shame and uncertainty and pain for the rest of his life. The incessant questioning of a conscious adulthood was never something that obstructed my brother. He got the meaning for his life some other way. I don't mean he was simple. Some people thought he was simple because all his life he was so kind. But Seymour was never that simple. Simple is never that simple. Still, the self-questioning did take some time to reach him. And if there's anything worse than self-questioning coming too early in life, it's self-questioning coming too late. His life was blown up by that bomb. The real victim of that bombing was him. What bomb? Little Mary's darling bomb. I don't know what Mary's darling bomb is. Meredith Lvov, Seymour's daughter. The Rimrock bomber was Seymour's daughter. The high school kid who blew up the post office, killed the doctor. The kid who stopped the war in Vietnam by blowing up somebody out mailing a letter at 5 a.m. A doctor on his way to the hospital. Charming child, he said in a voice that was all contempt, and still didn't seem to contain the load of contempt and hatred that he felt. Brought the war home to Lyndon Johnson by blowing up the post office in the general store. Place is so small, the post office is in the general store. Just a window at the back of the general store and a couple of rows of those boxes with the locks, and that's the whole post office. Get your stamps right in there with the Rinso and the Lifebuoy and the Lux. Quaint Americana. Seymour was into quaint Americana. But the kid wasn't. He took the kid out of real time, and she put him right back in. My brother thought he could take the family out of human confusion and into old Rimrock, and she put them right back in. Somehow, she plants a bomb back behind the post office window, and when it goes off, takes out the general store too, and it takes out the guy, this doctor, who's just stopping by the collection box to drop off his mail. Goodbye, Americana. Hello, real time. This passed me by. I had no idea. Well, that was 68, back when the wild behavior was still new. People suddenly forced to make sense of madness, all that public display, the dropping of inhibitions, authority powerless, the kids going crazy, intimidating everybody. The adults don't know what to make of it. They don't know what to do. Is this an act? Is the revolution real? Is it a game? Is it cops and robbers? What's going on here? Kids turning the country upside down, and so the adults start going crazy too. But Seymour wasn't one of them. He was one of the people who knew his way. He understood that something was going wrong, but he was no Ho Chi Minhite like his darling fat girl. Just a liberal sweetheart of a father, the philosopher king of ordinary life. Brought her up with all the modern ideas of being rational with your children, everything permissible, everything forgivable, and she hated it. People don't like to admit how much they resent other people's children, but this kid made it easy for you. She was miserable, self-righteous. Little shit was no good from the time she was born. Look, I got kids galore. I know what kids are like growing up. The black hole of self-absorption is bottomless, but it's one thing to get fat. It's one thing to let your hair grow long. It's one thing to listen to rock and roll music too loud, but it's another to jump the line and throw a bomb. That crime could never be made right. There was no way back for my brother from that bomb. The bomb detonated his life. His perfect life was over, just what she had in mind. That's why they had it in for him. The daughter and her friends, he was so in love with his own good luck, and they hated him for it. Once, we were all up at his place for Thanksgiving. The Dwyer mother, Dawn's kid brother Danny, Danny's wife, all the Lvovs, our kids, everybody. And Seymour got up to make a toast and said, I'm not a religious man, but when I look around this table, I know that something is shining down on me. It was him they were really out to get, and they did it. They got him. The bomb might as well have gone off in their living room. The violence done to his life was awful, horrible. Never in his life had occasion to ask himself, why are things the way they are? Why should he bother when the way they were was always perfect? Why are things the way they are? The question to which there is no answer, and up till then he was so blessed he didn't even know the question existed. Had Jerry ever before been so full of his brother's life and his brother's story? It didn't strike me that all the despotic determination concentrated in that strange head could ever have allowed him to divide his attention into very many parts. Not that death ordinarily impinges upon the majesty of self-obsession. Generally, it intensifies it. What about me? What if this happens to me? He told you it was horrible? Once, only once, Jerry replied. No, Seymour just took it and took it. You could stay on this guy. Stay on this guy. He'd just keep making the effort, Jerry said bitterly. Poor son of a bitch, that was his fate. Built for bearing burdens and taking shit. And with his saying this, I remembered those scrimmage pile-ups from which the Swede would extricate himself, always still clutching the ball, and how seriously I'd fallen in love with him on that late autumn afternoon long ago, when he transformed my 10-year-old existence by selecting me to enter the fantasy of Swede Lvov's life, when for a moment it had seemed that I too had been called to great things, and that nothing in the world could ever obstruct my way, now that our God's benign countenance had shed its light on me alone. Basketball was never like this, Skip. How captivatingly that innocence spoke to my own, the significance he had given me. It was everything a boy could have wanted. In 1943. Never caved in. He could be tough. Remember when we were kids? He joined the Marines to fight the Japs? Well, he was a goddamn Marine. Caved in only once, down in Florida, Jerry said. Just got to be too much for him. He brought the whole family down to visit us, the boys, and the second superbly selfish Mrs. Lvov. That was 2 years ago. We all went to the Stone Crab place. 12 of us for dinner. Lots of noise, the kids all showing off and laughing. Seymour loved it. The whole handsome family there, life just the way it's supposed to be. But when the pie and coffee came, he got up from the table, and when he didn't come back right away, I went out and found him in the car, in tears. shaking with sobs. I've never seen him like that. My brother, the Rock, he said, I miss my daughter. I said, where is she? I knew he always knew where she was. He'd been going to see her in hiding for years. I believe he saw her frequently. He said, she's dead, Jerry. I didn't believe him at first. It was to throw me off the track, I thought he must have just seen her somewhere. I thought he's still going to wherever she is and treating this killer like his own child, this killer who is now in her 40s, while everybody she killed is still killed. But then he threw his arms around me and he just let go, and I thought, is it true? The family's fucking monster's really dead? But why is he crying if she's dead? If he had half a brain, he would have realized that it was just too extraordinary to have a child like that. If he had half a brain, he would have been enraged by this kid and estranged from this kid long ago. Long ago, he would have torn her out of his gut and let her go. The angry kid who gets nuttier and nuttier, and the sanctified cause to hang her craziness on, crying like that. For her? No, I couldn't buy it, I said to him. I don't know whether you're lying to me or you're telling me the truth, but if you're telling me the truth that she's dead, it's the best news I ever heard. Nobody else is going to say this to you. Everybody else is going to commiserate, but I grew up with you. I talk straight to you. The best thing for you is for her to be dead. She didn't belong to you. She didn't belong to anything that you were. She didn't belong to anything anyone is. You played ball. There was a field of play. She was not on the field of play. She was nowhere near it. Simple as that. She was out of bounds, a freak of nature, way out of bounds. You are to stop your mourning for her. You've kept this wound open for 25 years, and 25 years is enough. It's driven you mad. Keep it open any longer and it's going to kill you. She's dead? Good. Let her go. Otherwise, it will rot in your gut and take your life too. That's what I told him. I thought I could let the rage out of him, but he just cried. He couldn't let go. I said, this guy was going to get killed from this thing, and he did. Jerry said it, and it happened. It's Jerry's theory that the Swede is nice, that is to say passive, that is to say trying always to do the right thing, a socially controlled character who doesn't burst out, doesn't yield to rage ever. Will not have the angry quality as his liability, so doesn't get it as an asset either. According to this theory, it's the no rage that kills him in the end, whereas aggression is cleansing or curing. It would seem that what kept Jerry going, without uncertainty or remorse and unflaggingly devoted to his own take on things, was that he had a special talent for rage and another special talent for not looking back. Doesn't look back at all, I thought. He's unseared by memory. To him, all looking back is bullshit nostalgia, including even the Swedes looking back 25 years later at his daughter before the bomb went off, looking back and helplessly weeping for all that went up in that explosion. Righteous anger at the daughter? No doubt that would have helped. Incontestable that nothing is more uplifting in all of life than righteous anger. But given the circumstances, wasn't it asking a lot? Asking the Swede to overstep the limits that made him identifiably the Swede? People must have been doing that to him all his life, assuming that because he was once upon a time this mythic character, the Swede, he had no limits. I'd done something like that in Vincent's restaurant, childishly expecting to be wowed by his godliness, only to be confronted by an utterly ordinary humanness. One price you pay for being taken for a god is the unabated dreaminess of your acolytes. You know Seymour's fatal attraction? Fatally attracted to his duty, Jerry said. Fatally attracted to responsibility. He could have played ball anywhere he wanted, but he went to Uppsala because my father wanted him near home. Giants offered him a double-A contract. Might have played one day with Willie Mays. Instead, he went down to Central Avenue to work for Newark Maid. My father started him off at a tannery, puts him for 6 months working in a tannery on Frelinghuysen Avenue, up 6 mornings a week at 5 a.m. You know what a tannery is? A tannery is a shithole. Remember those days in the summer, a strong wind from the east and the tanning stench wafts over Weequahic Park and covers the whole neighborhood? Well, he gets out of the tannery, Seymour does, strong as an ox, and my father sits him down at a sewing machine for another 6 months. And Seymour doesn't let out a peep. Just masters the fucking machine. Give him the pieces of glove, and he can close it up better than the sews and in half the time. He could have married any beauty he wanted. Instead, he marries the beautiful Miss Dwight. You should have seen them. Knockout couple. The two of them all smiles on their outward trip into the USA. She's post-Catholic, he's post-Jewish. Together they're going to go out there to old Rimrock to raise little post-toasties. Instead, they get that fucking kid. What was wrong with Miss Dwyer? No house they lived in was right. No amount of money in the bank was enough. He set her up in the cattle business, that didn't work. He set her up in the nursery treat business, that didn't work. He took her to Switzerland for the world's best facelift. Not even into her 50s, still in her 40s. But that's what the woman wants, so they schlepped to Geneva for a facelift from the guy who did Princess Grace. He would have been better off spending his life in Double-A ball. He would have been better off knocking up some waitress down there in Phoenix and playing first base for the Mudhens. That fucking kid. She stuttered, you know. So, to pay everybody back for her stuttering, she set off the bomb. He took her to speech therapist. He took her to clinics, to psychiatrists. There wasn't enough he could do for her. And the reward, boom! Why does this girl hate her father? This great father, this truly great father, good-looking, kind, providing, thinks about nothing really but them, his family. Why does she take off after him? That our own ridiculous father should have produced such a brilliant father? And that he should then produce her? Somebody tell me, what caused it? The genetic need to separate? For that, she has to run from Seymour Lvov to Che Guevara? No. What is the poison that caused it, that caused this poor guy to be placed outside his life for the rest of his life? He kept peering in from outside at his own life. The struggle of his life was to bury this thing, but could he? How? How could a big, sweet, agreeable putz like my brother be expected to deal with this bomb? One day, life started laughing at him, and it never let up. That was as far as we got, as much of an earful as I was to hear from Jerry. Anything more I wanted to know, I'd have to make up. Because just then, a small, gray-haired woman in a brown pantsuit came up to introduce herself, and Jerry, not a man equipped by nature to stand around more than 5 seconds while somebody else was getting a third party's attention, shot me a mock salute and disappeared. When I went looking for him later, I heard that he had to leave to catch a Newark plane back to Miami. After I'd already written about his brother, which is what I would do in the months to come, think about the Swede for 6, 8, sometimes 10 hours at a stretch, exchange my solitude for his, inhabit this person least like myself, disappear into him day and night, try to take the measure of a person of apparent blankness and innocence and simplicity, chart his collapse, make of him, as time wore on, the most important figure of my life. Just before I set about to alter names and disguise the most glaring marks of identification, I had the amateur's impulse to send Jerry a copy of the manuscript to ask what he thought. It was an impulse I quashed. I hadn't been writing and publishing for nearly 40 years not to know by now to quash it. That is not my brother, he'd tell me. Not in any way. You've misrepresented him. My brother couldn't think like that, then talk like that, etc. Yes. By this time, Jerry might well have recovered the objectivity that had deserted him directly after the funeral, and with it, the old resentment that helped make him the doctor at the hospital everybody was afraid to talk to because he was never wrong. Also, unlike most people whose dear one winds up as a model for the life drawing class, Jerry Lvov would probably be amused rather than outraged by my failure to grasp the Swede's tragedy the way he did. A strong possibility. Jerry's flipping derisively through my pages and giving me item by item the bad news. The wife was nothing like this. The kid was nothing like this. Got even my father wrong. I won't talk about what you do with me, but missing my father? Man, that's missing the side of a barn. Lou Lvov was a brute. Man, this guy is a pushover. He's charming. He's conciliatory. No, we had something go for us light years away from that. We had a sword. Dad, on the rampage, laid down the law, and that was it. No. Nothing bears the slightest resemblance. Here, for instance, giving my brother a mind? Awareness? This guy responds with consciousness to his loss, but my brother is a guy who had cognitive problems. This is nowhere like the mind he had. This is the mind he didn't have. Christ, you even give him a mistress. Perfectly misjudged, Zook. Absolutely. How could a big man like you fuck up like this? Well, Jerry wouldn't have gotten much of an argument from me had that turned out to be his reaction. I'd gone out to Newark and located the abandoned Newark Maid factory on a barren stretch of Lower Central Avenue. I went out to the Weequahic section to look at their house, now in disrepair, and to look at Keir Avenue, a street where it didn't seem like a good idea to get out of the car and walk up the driveway to the garage where the Swede used to practice his swing in the wintertime. 3 black kids were sitting on the front steps, eyeing me in the car. I explained to them, a friend of mine used to live here. When I got no answer, I added, back in the 40s. And then I drove away. I drove to Morristown to look at Mary's high school, and then on west to Old Rimrock, where I found the big stone house up on Arcady Hill Road, where the Seymour Lvovs once had lived as a happy young family. Later, down in the village, I drank a cup of coffee at the counter of the new general store, McPherson's, that had replaced the old general store, Hamlin's, whose post office the teenage Lvov daughter had blown up to bring the war home to America. I went to Elizabeth, where the Swede's beautiful Dawn was born and raised, and walked around her pleasant neighborhood, the residential Elmora section. I drove by her family's church, St. Genevieve's, and then headed due east to her father's neighborhood, the Old Port on the Elizabeth River, where the Cuban immigrants and their offspring replaced, back in the 60s, the last of the Irish immigrants and their offspring. I was able to get the New Jersey Miss America pageant office to dig up a glossy photo of Mary Dawn Dwyer, age 22, being crowned Miss New Jersey in May of 1949. I found another picture of her in a 1961 number of a Morris County Weekly, standing primly before her fireplace mantel in a blazer, a skirt, and a turtleneck sweater. Picture captioned, Mrs. Lvov, the former Miss New Jersey of 1949, loves living in a 160-year-old home, an environment which she says reflects the values of her family. At the Newark Public Library, I scanned microfilm sports pages of the Newark News, expired 1972, looking for accounts and box scores of games in which the Swede had shined for Weequahic High, in extremis, 1995, and Uppsala College, expired 1995. For the first time in 50 years, I reread the baseball books of John R. Tunis, and at one point even began to think of my book about the Swede as The Kid from Keir Avenue, calling it after Tunis's 1940 story for boys about the Tompkinsville, Connecticut orphan, whose only fault as a major leaguer is a tendency to keep his right shoulder down and his swing up, but a fault, alas, that is provocation enough for the gods to destroy him. Yet, despite these efforts and more to uncover what I could about the Swede and his world, I would have been willing to admit that my Swede was not the primary Swede. Of course, I was working with traces. Of course, essentials of what he was to Jerry were gone, expunged from my portrait, things I was ignorant of or I didn't want. Of course, the Swede was concentrated differently in my pages from how he had been concentrated in the flesh. But whether that meant I'd imagined an outright fantastical creature, lacking entirely the unique substantiality of the real thing, whether that meant my conception of the Swede was any more fallacious than the conception held by Jerry, which he wasn't likely to see as in any way fallacious, whether the Swede and his family came to life in me any less truthfully than in his brother, well, who knows? Who can know? When it comes to illuminating someone with the Swede's opacity, to understanding those regular guys everybody likes and who go about more or less incognito, it's up for grabs, it seems to me, as to whose guess is more rigorous than whose. "You don't remember me, do you?" asked the woman who had sent Jerry scurrying. Smiling warmly, she had taken my 2 hands in hers. Beneath the short-cropped hair, her head looked imposingly well-made, large and durable, its angular mass like the antique stone head of a Roman sovereign. Though the broad planes of her face were deeply scored as if with an engraving stylus, the skin beneath the rosy makeup looked to be seriously wrinkled only around the mouth, which, after nearly 6 hours of exchanging kisses, had lost most of its lipstick. Otherwise, there was an almost girlish softness to her flesh, indicating that perhaps she hadn't partaken of every last one of the varied forms of suffering available to a woman over a lifetime. "Don't look at my name tag. Who was I?" You tell me," I said. "Joyce. Joy Halpern. I had a pink Angora sweater, originally my cousin Estelle's. She was 3 years ahead of us. She's dead, Nathan. In the ground. My beautiful cousin Estelle, who smoked and dated older guys. In high school, she was dating a guy who shaved twice a day. Her parents had the dress and corset shop on Chancellor. Grossman's. My mother worked there. You took me on a class hayride. Believe it or not, I used to be Joy Halpern." Joy. A bright little girl with curly reddish hair, freckles, a round face, a girl with a provocative chubbiness that didn't go unobserved by Mr. Roscoe, a stout, red-nosed Spanish teacher who on the mornings when Joy came to school in a sweater was always asking her to stand at her desk to recite her homework. Mr. Roscoe called her Dimples. Amazing what you could get away with back in those days when it didn't seem to me anybody got away with anything. Because of an association of words not entirely implausible, Joy's figure had continued to tantalize me, no less than it had Mr. Roscoe, long after I last saw her springing up Chancellor Avenue to school in that odd but stirring pair of unclasped galoshes, obviously outgrown by her older brother and handed down to Joy like her beautiful cousin's Angora sweater. Whenever a couple of famous lines from John Keats happened, for whatever reason, to fall into my head, I'd invariably remember the full, plump feel of her beneath me, the wonderful buoyancy of her that my adolescent boy's exquisite radar sensed, even through my Mackinaw on the hayride. The lines are from Ode on Melancholy, him whose strenuous tongue can burst joy's grape against his palate fine. I remember that hayride, Joy Helpern. You weren't as kind on that hayride as you might have been. And now I look like Spencer Tracy, she said, breaking into laughter. Now that I'm no longer frightened, it's much too late. I used to be shy. I'm not shy anymore. Oh, Nathan, aging, she cried as we embraced each other. Aging. It's so very strange. You wanted to touch my bare breasts. I would have settled for that. Yes, she said. They were new then. Well, you were 14 and they were about 1. There's always been a 13-year difference. Back then, I was 13 years older than they were, and now they're about 13 years older than I am. But we certainly did kiss, didn't we, darling? Kissed and kissed and kissed. I practiced. All that afternoon, I practiced kissing. On whom? My fingers. Oh, I should have let you undo my bra. Undo it now if you'd like to. I'm afraid I haven't the daring anymore to undo a brassiere in front of the class. What a surprise. Just when I'm ready, Nathan's grown up. We bantered back and forth, our arms tied around each other and leaning backwards from the waist so each could see clearly what had happened to the other's face and figure, the external shape that half a century of living had bestowed. Yes, that overwhelming spell that we continue to cast on one another right down to the end, with the body's surface, which turns out to be, as I suspected on that hayride, about as serious a thing as there is in life. The body, from which one cannot strip oneself however one tries, from which one is not to be freed this side of death. Earlier, looking at Alan Meisner, I was looking at his father, and looking now at Joy, I was looking at her mother, the stout seamstress, with her stockings rolled down to her knees in the back room of Grossman's dress shop on Chancellor Avenue. But who I was thinking of was the Swede and the tyranny that his body held over him. The powerful, the gorgeous, the lonely Swede whom life had never made shrewd, who didn't want to pass through life as a beautiful boy and a stellar first baseman, who wanted instead to be a serious person for whom others came before himself, and not a baby for whose needs alone the wide, wide world of satisfactions had been organized. He wanted to have been born something more than a physical wonder, as if for one person that gift isn't enough. The Swede wanted what he took to be a higher calling, and his bad luck was to have found one. The responsibility of the school hero follows him through life. Noblesse oblige. You're the hero, so then you have to behave in a certain way. There's a prescription for it. You have to be modest, you have to be forbearing, you have to be deferential, you have to be understanding. And it all began, this heroically idealistic maneuver, this strategic, strange, spiritual desire to be a bulwark of duty and ethical obligation because of the war, because of all the terrible uncertainties bred by the war, because of how strongly an emotional community, whose beloved sons were far away facing death, had been drawn to a lean and muscular, austere boy whose talent it was to be able to catch anything anybody threw anywhere near him. It all began for the Swede, as what doesn't, in a circumstantial absurdity, and ended in another one, a bomb. When we met at Vincent's, perhaps he insisted on how well his 3 boys had turned out because he assumed I knew about the bomb, about the daughter, the Rimrock bomber, and had judged him harshly, as some people must have. Such a sensational thing, in his life certainly, even 27 years later, how could anybody not know or have forgotten? Maybe that explains why he couldn't stop himself, even if he wanted to, from going interminably on and on to me about the myriad nonviolent accomplishments of Chris, Steve, and Kent. Maybe that explains what he had wanted to talk about in the first place. The shocks that had befallen his father's loved ones was the daughter. She was the shocks that had befallen them all. This was what he had summoned me to talk about, had wanted me to help him write about, and I missed it. I, whose vanity is that he is never naive, was more naive by far than the guy I was talking to. Sitting there at Vincent's, getting the shallowest bead I could on the Swede, when the story he had to tell me was this one. The revelation of the interior life that was unknown and unknowable. The story that's tragic and awful and impossible to ignore. The ultimate reunion story, and I missed it entirely. The father was the cover. The burning subject was the daughter. How much of that was he aware of? All of it. He was aware of everything. I had that wrong, too. The unconscious one was me. He knew he was dying, and this terrible thing that had happened to him, that over the years he'd been partially able to bury, that somewhere along the way he had somewhat overcome, came back at him worse than ever. He put it aside as best he could. New wife, new kids, the 3 terrific boys. He sure seemed to me to have put it aside. That night in 1985, I saw him at Shea Stadium with young Chris. The Swede had got up off the ground, and he'd done it. A second marriage, a second shot at a unified life controlled by good sense and the classic restraints, once again, convention shaping everything, large and small, serving as barrier against the improbabilities. A second shot at being the traditional devoted husband and father, pledging allegiance all over again to the standard rules and regulations that are the heart of family order. He had the talent for it, had what it took to avoid anything disjointed, anything special, anything improper, anything difficult to assess or understand. And yet, not even the Swede, blessed with all the attributes of a monumental ordinariness, could shed that girl the way Jerry the Ripper had told him to, could go all the way and shed completely the frantic possessiveness, the paternal assertiveness, the obsessive love for the lost daughter. Shed every trace of that girl and that past and shake off forever the hysteria of my child. If only he could have just let her fade away. But not even the Swede was that great. He had learned the worst lesson that life can teach, that it makes no sense. And when that happens, the happiness is never spontaneous again. It's artificial, and even then, bought at the price of an obstinate estrangement from oneself and one's history. The nice, gentle man, with his mild way of dealing with conflict and contradiction, the confident ex-athlete, sensible and resourceful in any struggle with an adversary who's fair, comes up against the adversary who is not fair, the evil, ineradicable from human dealings, and he is finished. He, whose natural nobility was to be exactly what he seemed to be, has taken in far too much suffering to be naively whole again. Never again will the Swede be content in the trusting, old, Swedian way that, for the sake of his second wife and their 3 boys, for the sake of their naive wholeness, he ruthlessly goes on pretending to be. Stoically, he suppresses his horror. He learns to live behind a mask, a lifetime experiment in endurance, a performance over a ruin. Swede Lvov lives a double life. And now he's dying, And what sustained him in a double life can sustain him no longer. And that horror mercifully half submerged, 2/3 submerged, even at times 9/10 submerged, comes back distilled despite the heroic creation of that second marriage and the fathering of the wonderful boys. In the final months of the cancer, it's back worse than ever. She's back worse than ever. The first child who was the cancellation of everything. And one night in bed when he can't sleep, when every effort fails to control his runaway thoughts, he's so depleted by his anguish he thinks, there's this guy who was in my brother's class, he's a writer, and maybe if I told him. But what would happen if he told the writer? He doesn't even know. I'll write him a letter. I know he writes about fathers, about sons, so I'll write him about my father. Can you turn that down? Maybe he'll respond to that. The hook to which I am to be the eye. But I come because he's the Swede. No other hook is necessary. He is the hook. Yes, the story was back worse than ever, and he thought, if I can give it to a pro. But when he got me there, he couldn't deliver. Once he got my attention, he didn't want it. He thought better of it, and he was right. It was none of my business. What good would it have done him? None at all. You go to someone and you think, I'll tell him this. But why? The impulse is that the telling is going to relieve you. And that's why you feel awful later. You've relieved yourself. And if it truly is tragic and awful, it's not better, it's worse. The exhibitionism inherent to a confession has only made the misery worse. The Swede realized this. He was nothing like the chump I was imagining, and he figured this out simply enough. He realized that there was nothing to be had through me. He certainly didn't want to cry in front of me the way he had with his brother. I wasn't his brother. I wasn't anyone. That's what he saw when he saw me. So he just blabbered deliberately on about the boys and went home, and the story untold, he died. And I missed it. He turned to me, of all people, and he was conscious of everything, and I missed everything. And now, Chris, Steve, Kent, and their mother would be at the Rimrock house, perhaps along with the Swede's old mother, with Mrs. Lvov. The mother must be 90, sitting shiva at 90 for her beloved Seymour. And the daughter, Meredith, Mary, obviously hadn't attended the funeral. Not with that outsized uncle around who hated her guts, that vindictive uncle who might even take it upon himself to turn her in. But with Jerry now gone, she dares to leave her hideout to join in the mourning, makes her way to old Rimrock, perhaps in disguise, and there, alongside her half-brothers and her stepmother and Grandma Lvov, weeps her heart out over her father's death. But now she was dead too. If the Swede had been telling Jerry the truth, the daughter in hiding had died. Perhaps in hiding she had been murdered or had even taken her own life. Anything might have occurred. And anything wasn't supposed to occur. Not to him. The brutality of the destruction of this indestructible man. Whatever happened to Swede Lvov? Surely not what befell the kid from Tompkinsville. Even as boys, we must have known that it couldn't have been quite as easy for him as it looked, that a part of it was a mystique. But who could have imagined that his life would come apart in this horrible way? A sliver off the comet of the American chaos had come loose and spun all the way out to old Rimrock and him. His great looks, his larger-than-lifeness, his glory, our sense of his having been exempted from all self-doubt by his heroic role, that all these manly properties had precipitated a political murder, made me think of the compelling story not of John Artunis's sacrificial Tompkinsville kid, but of Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, only a decade the Swede senior and another privileged son of fortune. Another man of glamour exuding American meaning, assassinated while still in his mid-40s, just 5 years before the Swede's daughter violently protested the Kennedy-Johnson War and blew up her father's life. I thought, but of course, he's our Kennedy. Meanwhile, Joy was telling me things about her life that I'd never known as a single-minded kid searching the neighborhood for a grape to burst. Joy was tossing into this agitated pot of memory called The Reunion, yet more stuff no one knew at the time, that no one had to know back when all our storytelling about ourselves was still eloquently naive. Joy was telling me about how her father had died of a heart attack when she was 9, and the family was living in Brooklyn, about how she and her mother and Harold, her older brother, had moved from Brooklyn to the Newark haven of Grossman's dress shop, about how in the attic space above the shop, she and her mother slept in the double bed in their one big room while Harold slept in the kitchen on the sofa. He made up each night and unmade each morning so they could eat breakfast there before going to school. She asked if I remembered Harold, now a retired pharmacist in Scotch Plains, and told me how just the week before she'd gone out to the cemetery in Brooklyn to visit her father's grave. As frequently as once a month she went out there, all the way to Brooklyn, she said, surprised herself by how much this graveyard now mattered to her. What do you do at the cemetery? I unabashedly talked to him, Joy said. When I was 10, it wasn't nearly as bad as it is now. I thought then it was odd that people had 2 parents. Our threesome seemed right. Well, all this, I told her as we stood there just swaying together to the one-man band closing the day down singing Dream. Dream when you're feeling blue. Dream, that's the thing to do. All this I didn't know, I told her. On the Harvest Moon hayride in October 1948. I didn't want you to know. I didn't want anybody to know. I didn't want anybody to find out Harold slept in the kitchen. That's why I wouldn't let you undo my bra. I didn't want you to be my boyfriend and come to pick me up and see where my brother had to sleep. It had nothing to do with you, sweetheart. Well, I feel better for being told that. I wish you told me sooner. I wish I had, she said. And first we were laughing, and then unexpectedly, Joy began to cry, and perhaps because of that damn song Dream, which we used to dance to with the lights turned down, in somebody or other's basement back when the Pied Pipers still had Joe Stafford and used to sing it the way it's supposed to be sung, in locked harmony to that catatonic 40s beat with the ethereal tinkle of the xylophone hollowly sounding behind them. Or perhaps because Alan Meisner had become a Republican and second baseman Bert Bergman had become a corpse and Ira Posner, instead of shining shoes at the newsstand outside the Essex County Courthouse, had escaped his Dostoevskian family and become a psychiatrist, because Julius Pincus had disabling tremors from the drug that prevented the rejection from his body of the 14-year-old girl's kidney keeping him alive, and because Mindy Gerlich was still a horny 17-year-old kid, and because Joy's brother Harold had slept for 10 years in a kitchen, and because Schrimmer had married a woman nearly half his age who had a body that didn't make him want to slit his throat, but to whom he now had to explain every single thing about the past. Or perhaps because I seemed alone in having wound up with no children, grandchildren, or, in Minskoff's words, anything like that. Or perhaps because, after all these years of separation, this reuniting of perfect strangers had all gone on a little too long. A load of unruly emotion began sliding around in me too, and there I was thinking again of the Swede, of the notorious significance that an outlaw daughter had thrust on him and his family during the Vietnam War. A man whose discontents were barely known to himself, awakening in middle age to the horror of self-reflection. All that normalcy interrupted by murder. All the small problems any family expects to encounter exaggerated by something so impossible ever to reconcile. The disruption of the anticipated American future that was simply to have unrolled out of the solid American past, out of each generation's getting smarter for knowing the inadequacies and limitations of the generations before, out of each new generation's breaking away from the parochialism a little further, out of the desire to go the limit in America with your rights, forming yourself as an ideal person who gets rid of the traditional Jewish habits and attitudes, who frees himself of the pre-America insecurities and the old, constraining obsessions, so as to live unapologetically as an equal among equals. And then the loss of the daughter. the fourth American generation, a daughter on the run, who was to have been the perfected image of himself, as he had been the perfected image of his father, and his father the perfected image of his father's father. The angry, rebarbative, spitting-out daughter, with no interest whatever in being the next successful Lvov, flushing him out of hiding as if he were a fugitive, initiating the Swede into the displacement of another America entirely, the daughter and the decade blasting to smithereens his particular form of utopian thinking. The plague America infiltrating the Swede's castle and there infecting everyone. The daughter who transports him out of the longed-for American pastoral and into everything that is its antithesis and its enemy, into the fury, the violence, and the desperation of the counter-pastoral, into the indigenous American berserk. The old intergenerational give and take of the country that used to be, when everyone knew his role and took the rules dead seriously. The acculturating back and forth that all of us here grew up with, the ritual post-immigrant struggle for success turning pathological in, of all places, the gentleman farmer's castle of our super-ordinary Swede. A guy stacked like a deck of cards for things to unfold entirely differently, in no way prepared for what's going to hit him. How could he, with all his carefully calibrated goodness, have known that the stakes of living obediently was so high? Obedience is embraced to lower the stakes. A beautiful wife, a beautiful house, runs his business like a charm, handles his handful of an old man well enough. He was really living it out, his version of paradise. This is how successful people live. They're good citizens, they feel lucky, they feel grateful. God is smiling down on them. There are problems, they adjust. And then everything changes, and it becomes impossible. Nothing is smiling down on anybody. And who can adjust then? Here is someone not set up for life's working out poorly, let alone for the impossible. But who is set up for the impossible that's going to happen? Who is set up for tragedy and the incomprehensibility of suffering? Nobody. The tragedy of the man not set up for tragedy, that is every man's tragedy. He kept peering in from outside at his own life. The struggle of his life was to bury this thing, but how could he? Never in his life had occasion to ask himself, why are things the way they are? Why should he bother when the way they were was always perfect? Why are things the way they are? The question to which there is no answer. And up till then he was so blessed, he didn't even know the question existed. After all the effervescent strain of resuscitating our class's mid-century innocence, together, 100 aging people recklessly turning back the clock to a time when time's passing was a matter of indifference, with the afternoon's exhilarations finally coming to an end, I began to contemplate the very thing that must have baffled the Swede till the moment he died. How had he become history's plaything? History, American history, the stuff you read about in books and study in school, had made its way out to tranquil, untrafficked old Rimrock, New Jersey, to countryside where it had not put in an appearance that was notable since Washington's army twice wintered in the highlands adjacent to Morristown. History, which had made no drastic impingement on the daily life of the local populace since the Revolutionary War, wended its way back out to these cloistered hills and, improbably, with all its predictable unforeseenness, broke helter-skelter into the orderly household of the Seymour Lvovs and left the place in a shambles. People think of history in the long term, but history, in fact, is a very sudden thing. In earnest, right then and there, while swaying with joy to that out-of-date music, I began to try to work out for myself what exactly had shaped a destiny unlike any imagined for the famous Weewayick three-letterman, back when this music and its sentimental exhortation was right to the point, when the Swede, his neighborhood, his city, and his country were in their exuberant heyday, at the peak of confidence inflated with every illusion born of hope. With Joy Helpern once again close in my arms, and quietly sobbing, to hear the old pop tune enjoining all of us 60-odd-year-olds, "Dream, and they might come true," I lifted the Swede up onto the stage. That evening at Vincent's, For 1,000 different excellent reasons, he couldn't bring himself to ask me to do this. For all I know, he had no intention of asking me to do this. To get me to write his story may not have been why he was there at all. Maybe it was only why I was there. Basketball was never like this. He'd invoke in me when I was a boy, as he did in hundreds of other boys, the strongest fantasy I had of being someone else. But to wish oneself into another's glory, as a boy or as a man, is an impossibility, untenable on psychological grounds if you are not a writer, and on aesthetic grounds if you are. To embrace your hero in his destruction, however, to let your hero's life occur within you when everything is trying to diminish him, to imagine yourself into his bad luck, to implicate yourself not in his mindless ascendancy when he's the fixed point of your adulation, but in the bewilderment of his tragic fall. Well, that's worth thinking about. So then, I'm out there on the floor with joy, and I'm thinking of the Swede and of what happened to his country in a mere 25 years, between the triumphant days at wartime Reykjavik High and the explosion of his daughter's bomb in 1968, of that mysterious, troubling, extraordinary historical transition. I'm thinking of the 60s and of the disorder occasioned by the Vietnam War, of how certain families lost their kids and certain families didn't, and how the Simolovovs were one of those that did. Families full of tolerance and kindly, well-intentioned, liberal goodwill, and theirs were the kids who went on a rampage, or went to jail, or disappeared underground, or fled to Sweden or Canada. I'm thinking of the Swede's great fall and how he must have imagined that it was founded on some failure of his own responsibility. There is where it must begin. It doesn't matter if he was the cause of anything. He makes himself responsible anyway. He has been doing that all his life, making himself unnaturally responsible, keeping under control not just himself, but whatever else threatens to be uncontrollable, giving his all to keep his world together. Yes, the cause of the disaster has, for him, to be a transgression. How else would the Swede explain it to himself? It has to be a transgression, a single transgression, even if it's only he who identifies it as a transgression. The disaster that befalls him begins in a failure of his responsibility as he imagines it. But what could that have been? Dispelling the aura of the dinner at Vincent's, when I'd rushed to conclude the most thoughtless conclusion, that simple was that simple, I lifted onto my stage the boy we were all going to follow into America, our point man into the next immersion, at home here the way the wasps were at home here. An American not by sheer striving, not by being a Jew who invents a famous vaccine or a Jew on the Supreme Court, not by being the most brilliant or the most eminent or the best. Instead, by virtue of his isomorphism to the wasp world, he does it the ordinary way, the natural way, the regular American guy way. To the honey-sweet strains of dream, I pulled away from myself, pulled away from the reunion, and I dreamed. I dreamed a realistic chronicle. I began gazing into his life. Not his life as a god or a demigod in whose triumphs one could exult as a boy, but his life as another assailable man. And inexplicably, which is to say, lo and behold, I found him in Deal, New Jersey, at the seaside cottage the summer his daughter was 11, back when she couldn't stay out of his lap or stop calling him by cute pet names, couldn't resist, as she put it, examining with the tip of her finger the close way his ears were fitted to his skull. Wrapped in a towel, she'd run through the house and out to the clothesline to fetch a dry bathing suit, shouting as she went, "Nobody look!" And several evenings she barged into the bathroom where he was bathing, and when she saw him, cried out, "Oh, pardonnez-moi, j'ai pensé que..." "Scram," he told her. "Get out of here, moi." Driving alone with him back from the beach one day that summer, dopily sun-drunk, lolling against his bare shoulder, she turned up her face and half innocently, half audaciously, precociously playing the grown-up girl, said, "Daddy, kiss me the way you kissed Mother. Sun-drunk himself, voluptuously fatigued from rolling all morning with her in the heavy surf, he looked down to see that one of the shoulder straps of her swimsuit had dropped over her arm, and there was her nipple, the hard, red bee-bite that was her nipple. No, he said, and stunned them both. And fix your suit, he added feebly. Soundlessly she obeyed. I'm sorry, Cookie. Oh, I deserve it, she said, trying with all her might to hold back her tears and be his chirpingly charming pal again. It's the same at school. It's the same with my friends. I get started with something and I can't stop. I just get carried. It was a while since he had seen her turn white like that or had seen her face contorted like that. She fought for the word longer than, on that particular day, he could possibly bear. And yet he knew better than anyone what not to do when, as Mary put it, she started fumphing to beat the band. He was the parent she could always rely on not to jump all over it every time she opened her mouth. Cool it, he would tell Dawn. Relax, lay off her. But Dawn couldn't help herself. Mary began to stutter badly, and Dawn's hands were clasped at her waist, and her eyes fixed on the child's lips, eyes that said, I know you can do it, while saying, I know that you can't. Mary's stuttering just killed her mother, and that killed Mary. I'm not the problem, Mother is. And so was the teacher the problem when she tried to spare Mary by not calling on her. So was everybody the problem when they started feeling sorry for her. And when she was fluent suddenly and free of stuttering, the problem was the compliments. She resented terribly being praised for fluency, and as soon as she was praised, she lost it completely. Sometimes, Mary would say, to the point that she was afraid, I'm going to short out my whole system. Amazing how this child could summon up the strength to joke about it. His precious, light-hearted jokester. If only it were within Dawn's power to become a little light-hearted about it herself. But it was the sweet alone who could always manage to be close to perfect with her. Though even he had all he could do not to cry out in exasperation. If you dare the gods and are fluent, what terrible thing do you think will happen? The exasperation never surfaced. He didn't wring his hands like a mother, and when she was in trouble, he didn't watch her lips or mouth or words with her like her mother. He didn't turn her every time she spoke into the most important person, not merely in the room, but in the entire world. He did everything he could not to make her stigma into Mary's way of being Einstein. Instead, his eyes assured her that he would do all he could to help, but that when she was with him, she must stutter freely if she needed to. And yet he had said to her, no. He had done what Dawn would rather die than do. He had made fun of her. Oh, Cookie, he said, and at just the moment when he understood that the summer's mutual, seemingly harmless play-acting, the two of them nibbling at an intimacy too enjoyable to swear off, and yet not in any way to be taken seriously, to be much concerned with, to be given an excessive significance, something utterly uncarnal that would fade away once the vacation was over, and she was in school all day and he had returned to work, nothing that they couldn't easily find their way back from. Just when he had come to understand that the summer romance required some readjusting all around, he lost his vaunted sense of proportion, drew her to him with one arm, and kissed her stammering mouth with the passion that she had been asking him for all month long, while knowing only obscurely what she was asking for. Was he supposed to feel that way? It happened before he could think. She was only 11. Momentarily, it was frightening. This wasn't anything he had ever worried about for a second. This was a taboo that you didn't even think of as a taboo. Something you're prohibited from doing that felt absolutely natural not to do. You just proceeded effortlessly. And then, however momentary, this. Never in his entire life, not as a son, a husband, a father, even as an employer, had he given way to anything so alien to the emotional rules by which he was governed, and later he wondered if this strange parental misstep was not the lapse from responsibility for which he paid for the rest of his life. The kiss bore no resemblance to anything serious, wasn't an imitation of anything, had never been repeated, had itself lasted 5 seconds, 10 at most. But after the disaster, when he went obsessively searching for the origins of their suffering, it was that anomalous moment when she was 11 and he was 36, and the two of them, all stirred up by the strong sea and the hot sun, were heading happily home alone from the beach, that he remembered. But then he also wondered if after that day he had perhaps withdrawn from her too radically, become physically distant more than was necessary. He'd only meant to let her know she needn't be concerned that he would lose his equilibrium again, needn't worry about her own natural enough infatuation, and the result may well have been that, having exaggerated the implications of that kiss, having overestimated what constituted provocation, he went on to alter a perfectly harmless, spontaneous bond, only to exacerbate a stuttering child's burden of self-doubt. And all he had ever meant was to help her heal. What then was the wound? What could have wounded Mary? The indelible imperfection itself, or those who had fostered in her the imperfection? But by doing what? What had they done other than to love her and look after her and encourage her, give her the support and guidance and independence that seemed reasonable to them? And still the undisclosed Mary had become tainted, twisted, crazed by what? Thousands upon thousands of young people studied. They didn't all grow up to set off bombs. What went wrong with Mary? What did he do to her that was so wrong? The kiss? That kiss? So beastly? How could a kiss make someone into a criminal? The aftermath of the kiss? The withdrawal? Was that the beastliness? But it wasn't as though he'd never held her or touched her or kissed her again. He loved her. She knew that. Once the inexplicable had begun, the torment of self-examination never ended. However lame the answers, he never ran out of questions. He, who before had nothing of consequence really to ask himself. After the bomb, he could never again take life as it came, or trust that his life wasn't something very different from what he perceived. He found himself recalling his own happy childhood, the success that had been his boyhood, as though that were the cause of their blight. All the triumphs, when he probed them, seemed superficial. Even more astonishing, his very virtues came to seem vices. There was no longer any innocence in what he remembered of his past. He saw that everything you say says either more than you wanted it to say or less than you wanted it to say. And everything you do does either more than you wanted it to do or less than you wanted it to do. What you said and did made a difference, all right, but not the difference you intended. The Swede, as he had always known himself, well-meaning, well-behaved, well-ordered Sima Lvov, evaporated, leaving only self-examination in his place. He couldn't disentangle himself from the idea that he was responsible any more than he could resort to the devilishly tempting idea that everything was accidental.